What happens when a tiny Pacific island built on bird droppings suddenly finds itself wealthier than almost any place on Earth? Nauru, just 8 square miles and home to fewer than 11,000 people, reached a peak GDP per capita of about $27,000 in 1981, roughly $88,000 in today's terms. For a brief period, Nauruans enjoyed luxury cars, private jets, and ambitious banking schemes, all fueled by phosphate money. But by 2005, the phosphate had run out and Nauru's GDP had plunged by over 90%. Today, in 2025, the country's economy remains largely dependent on foreign aid. To understand how this happened, we have to start with the unlikely source of all that wealth. From bird poop to billionaires. Centuries before phosphate became a global commodity, seabirds flocked to this remote Pacific island, blanketing it with droppings that slowly transformed the landscape. Over thousands of years, layer upon layer of guano and decomposed marine life built up into dense phosphate deposits, eventually covering about 80% of Nauru's surface. When European prospectors identified these reserves in the early 1900s, they realized the island was perched atop a substance essential for modern agriculture. The nutrient-rich phosphate, formed by nature's slow processes, would soon turn Nauru into a key supplier for the world's farms. Mining operations began in 1906, initially under German colonial rule. After World War I, Australia took over administration, and phosphate extraction continued at a rapid pace. For decades, foreign companies and colonial powers reaped most of the profits, while Nauruans saw little benefit. That changed in 1968, when the island gained independence and took control of its phosphate industry. By the late 1970s, exports peaked at over 2 million tons a year. For a country with fewer than 10,000 people, the numbers were staggering. Annual phosphate revenues soared past $100 million. The impact of this windfall was immediate and dramatic. In 1981, Nauru's GDP per capita reached about $27,000, nearly double the United States' $14,000 at the time, and equivalent to $88,000 today. On paper, Nauru was the richest country in the world. The government eliminated income taxes and began providing free healthcare and education. Landowners received regular royalty payments, and for many Nauruans, traditional fishing and farming gave way to a life of comfort and leisure. Imported goods filled store shelves. Luxury cars, particularly Mercedes-Benzes, became a common sight on the island's 30 kilometers of paved roads. Residents traveled frequently to Australia, often returning with expensive electronics and designer clothing. The government's newfound wealth funded a spree of investments and ambitious projects. Nauru Airlines, equipped with a fleet of Boeing 737s, was launched despite the island's lack of tourism and tiny population. The government acquired high-profile real estate abroad, including commercial properties in Australia and a $10 million investment in a struggling London musical theatre. These ventures were meant to secure the country's financial future and diversify its income streams, but most would end up as costly mistakes. Several overseas properties were repossessed after Nauru failed to meet loan payments, and the airline operated at a loss for years. Throughout the boom years, the sense of prosperity was overwhelming. The government constructed a sprawling civic center, complete with imported Italian marble. Social programs expanded, and nearly every resident was employed directly or indirectly by the phosphate sector. With so much money circulating, the island's small economy became highly specialized and dependent on extraction. Food production dwindled as imported goods replaced local crops. Fishing and farming, once the backbone of daily life, faded into the background. Most people worked for the government or in mining, leaving few with skills that could be applied outside this narrow sector. Warnings about the dangers of relying on a single resource were easy to ignore. A handful of officials and outside advisors urged the creation of a sovereign wealth fund to safeguard future generations, but political divisions and short-term thinking prevailed. Instead of investing for the long term, the government continued to spend as if the phosphate would last forever. By 1990, Nauru had earned the modern equivalent of $15 billion from phosphate sales, yet almost nothing was set aside for when the mines inevitably ran dry. Signs of trouble began to surface as early as the mid-1980s. Phosphate reserves, once so abundant, showed clear signs of depletion. Strip mining had already consumed most of the easily accessible deposits, leaving behind jagged coral pinnacles and barren ground. Despite this, spending continued. In 1995, with phosphate production down by 60% from its peak, the government approved the construction of a 32-story luxury hotel in Melbourne. The tower stood mostly empty quickly, becoming a symbol of Nauru's financial mismanagement. Meanwhile, bulldozers on the island scraped away the last seams of phosphate, and government budgets became increasingly dependent on borrowing against future mining royalties that would never materialize. As the phosphate industry declined, the economic foundations of the country began to crumble. The workforce, highly concentrated in mining and government jobs, struggled to adapt. The few remaining private businesses faced shrinking demand as public sector employment propped up the entire economy. Imported food and goods became ever more essential, while the skills needed for self-sufficiency faded. Attempts to reform the economy or reduce government spending faced strong resistance from those who benefited most from the status quo. Financial advisors who cautioned against over-reliance on phosphate were largely dismissed. The government's overseas investments failed to generate the expected returns, and several projects turned into liabilities. The London musical theatre venture lost millions, and the airline's operating costs far outstripped its revenues. The trust fund established to manage phosphate wealth was poorly managed and depleted by bad loans and risky ventures. By the late 1990s, the consequences of decades of mismanagement were impossible to ignore. The Resource Curse, a phenomenon where countries rich in natural resources often experience slower growth and worse outcomes, became Nauru's reality. The island's tiny population and concentrated wealth amplified the effects. With no meaningful economic diversification and little saved for the future, Nauru's fortunes were tied almost entirely to a single, finite resource. When the last profitable phosphate shipments left the island in the early 2000s, the country faced a stark new reality. The legacy of these choices extended beyond economics. The mining that had fueled Nauru's rise left deep scars on the land, stripping away not just soil, but the very foundation of the island's ecosystem. The prosperity of the boom years faded quickly, replaced by mounting debt and growing dependence on foreign aid. The transformation of Nauru from one of the world's richest countries per capita to one of its most vulnerable was not just a story of financial mismanagement, but of irreversible environmental change. The mining disaster you can see from space. The transformation of Nauru's landscape is visible even from space, a stark testament to the scale of its phosphate mining disaster. Where lush forests and fertile soil once covered the island's interior, mining operations carved away everything, leaving behind a barren expanse of jagged coral pinnacles and exposed rock. Satellite images show a sharp divide. Thin ribbons of green along the coast, and an interior that looks more like a lunar surface than a tropical island. Around 80% of Nauru's land is now uninhabitable, stripped of any soil or vegetation that could support life. This devastation began with the systematic removal of topsoil and native plants to access the phosphate-rich layers beneath. No part of the mining process attempted to preserve or restore the ecosystem. As the land was scraped bare, traditional agriculture withered. Before mining, Nauruans cultivated coconuts, pandanus, and bananas in the island's interior. After decades of extraction, less than a fifth of the island retained soil capable of supporting even the hardiest crops. The remaining arable land is confined to the narrow coastal fringe, forcing Nauruans to depend almost entirely on imported food. The loss of fertile ground had immediate and long-term consequences. As mining runoff seeped into the porous limestone beneath the island, it contaminated the freshwater lens, a vital resource on an atoll with no rivers or lakes. Today, Nauru's drinking water comes mainly from desalination plants, a necessity driven by the mining legacy. The cost of maintaining these plants strains the national budget, and water shortages are common during periods of high demand or mechanical failure. The ecological toll extended beyond the loss of plants and soil. The extinction of several native bird species, including some populations of knotted terns and frigate birds, illustrates the depth of the damage. These seabirds, once abundant and central to the island's ecosystem, abandoned their nesting grounds as habitat vanished. The plants they depended on, such as pandanus and native hardwoods, disappeared from mined areas. Marine life also suffered as sediment runoff and debris from mining operations smothered nearby reefs, disrupting fish populations and coral health. The destruction of the island's interior erased more than just biodiversity. It severed cultural ties that had connected Nauruans to their land for generations. Traditional practices like weaving with pandanus leaves or cultivating taro and breadfruit became impossible as the plants vanished. The loss of these customs left a void in daily life, as imported foods and materials replaced locally sourced ones. The physical scars of mining are impossible to ignore. Google Earth reveals a stark contrast between the untouched coastal margins and the mine's center, where white coral outcrops jut from the ground in dense, irregular patterns. Some pits reach depths of up to 25 meters, creating hazardous terrain that blocks any meaningful redevelopment. The land is so uneven and rocky that even walking across it is dangerous. Construction of new homes, schools, or infrastructure is limited to the thin coastal belt, forcing the population into ever more crowded conditions. Attempts to rehabilitate the mined landscape have met with little success. In the 1990s, the Australian government funded a $50 million rehabilitation project, but the scale of the damage dwarfed the effort. Restoration efforts since then have made only marginal progress, with most of the interior lands still barren. A few experimental plots of imported soil support limited agriculture, but most replanting efforts fail within a few years. The harsh, exposed coral offers little for roots to cling to, and the absence of shade or organic matter makes it nearly impossible for new plants to survive. Mining companies and colonial administrators prioritized short-term profits over environmental planning. The extraction process worked in outward circles from the coast, stripping each sector completely before moving on. Waste from mining was dumped without restraint, and runoff flowed directly into the ocean, clouding the water and damaging marine habitats. Oversight was minimal, and environmental warnings, raised as early as the 1920s, went unheeded. Even after independence in 1968, Nauru's government struggled to slow the pace of mining, caught between the need for revenue and the mounting evidence of irreversible harm. The consequences of this approach became clear well before the phosphate ran out. As early as the 1960s, Nauruan leaders and outside scientists warned that the island's future was at risk. Yet economic pressures, political infighting, and the allure of continued wealth kept the mines running at full tilt. By the time extraction ceased in the early 2000s, the damage was complete. The interior, once the island's breadbasket and ecological heart, had become an inhospitable wasteland. Climate change now adds to these challenges. With so much of the island uninhabitable, the population is squeezed into the low-lying coastal zone. Rising sea levels threaten to erode these last habitable strips, while more intense storms damage infrastructure built on unstable ground. The loss of vegetation has raised average temperatures by nearly 2 degrees Celsius since the 1970s, making the island hotter and less comfortable. These changes put further strain on a population already struggling with the consequences of environmental decline. Daily life in Nauru is shaped by the mining legacy in countless ways. Dust from the exposed interior blows across the island during dry seasons, aggravating respiratory illnesses. Studies show that nearly 70% of children under age 5 experience acute respiratory infections, a rate far higher than in neighboring countries. Cadmium and other pollutants from mining have tainted both the air and what little water remains. The unstable, rocky ground prevents the construction of new buildings and even affects burial practices. Traditional grave sites are no longer possible, so concrete crypts have become the norm. The environmental devastation also undermined any hope for a diversified economy. Without arable land, Nauru imports more than 90% of its food at great cost. The lack of fresh water makes the island dependent on expensive desalination, and tourism never developed because the mined landscape holds little appeal compared to other Pacific destinations. The costs of maintaining basic services continue to rise, draining government resources and limiting investment in other areas. International observers often compare Nauru's mined interior to war zones or nuclear test sites. The comparison is not exaggerated. The environmental damage exceeds what many conflicts have inflicted on much larger territories. Unlike the sudden destruction of war, Nauru's transformation happened gradually, normalized over generations until it became irreversible. The tragedy is that it was both predictable and preventable. Scientists and local leaders warned of the consequences, but economic interests always took precedence. Recent efforts to restore the environment face steep obstacles. Small-scale farming projects on imported soil have shown limited results. Solar panels now dot some mined areas, helping to reduce reliance on diesel imports, but they cover only a fraction of the island's energy needs. Marine conservation zones, established in recent years, offer some hope for the reefs and fish populations. Still, these measures cannot bring back the unique ecosystem that mining destroyed. The pre-mining landscape, with its forests and rich biodiversity, is gone for good. What remains is a landscape marked by empty quarries and coral spires, a monument to choices made in pursuit of short-term gain. These scars are a daily reminder of the costs of ignoring environmental limits. The mining disaster did not just alter the island's appearance. It locked Nauru into a cycle of dependence and vulnerability that continues to shape its present. As the last phosphate shipments left the island and the interior fell silent, Nauru faced a new reality. The foundation of its economy had been scraped away along with the soil, leaving the country exposed to challenges it was ill-prepared to meet. The consequences of decades of environmental neglect would soon be matched by an equally dramatic economic collapse. When the money ran out, as the last profitable phosphate shipments left Nauru in the early 2000s, the country's economic reality shifted overnight. The resource that had underpinned every aspect of life, funding government salaries, social programs, and even daily consumption, was gone. The island's economy, built almost entirely around phosphate mining, had no fallback. For decades, warnings about the dangers of single-resource dependence went unheeded. Now, with the mines exhausted, Nauru faced an abrupt reckoning. The numbers reflected the severity of the collapse. Nauru's GDP per capita, which had reached about $88,000 in 1981, fell sharply over the following decades. By 2021, it hovered around $10,000 to $12,000, a dramatic drop that erased the island's brief period as the world's richest nation per capita. Unemployment spiked from near zero to over 90% in the early 2000s, wiping out most jobs as the mining companies packed up and left. Families who once relied on steady paychecks from the phosphate industry suddenly found themselves without income or prospects. Financial mismanagement made the crisis even worse. The Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust, established to secure the nation's future after mining, was meant to provide a cushion during lean years. But poor oversight, risky investments, and outright fraud drained its value at an astonishing rate. The fund's assets dropped from 1.3 billion Australian dollars in the early 1990s to just 300 million Australian dollars by 2004. Among the most notorious missteps was the government's investment in Leonardo the Musical, A Portrait of Love, a West End production that flopped spectacularly and became a symbol of waste. Equally damaging were failed purchases of luxury real estate in places like Hawaii and Australia, bought at market peaks and sold at steep losses. These emblematic failures left Nauru without the reserves it desperately needed as phosphate revenues dried up. The collapse rippled through every sector of society. Commercial enterprises folded one after another. The national airline, once a point of pride with a small fleet of Boeing 737s connecting Nauru to Australia and the Pacific, racked up $20 million in debt before shutting down in 2005. The loss of the airline left the island isolated, with only irregular charter flights maintaining any connection to the outside world. Efforts to diversify the economy proved equally disastrous. In the 1990s, Nauru tried to reinvent itself as an offshore banking haven, hosting more than 400 shell banks at its peak. But international pressure, especially from the United States, led to sanctions and the closure of the sector by 2005. These failed schemes deepened the country's financial hole rather than filling it. As government revenues vanished, public services deteriorated rapidly. Hospitals ran short on basic medicines and equipment, leaving patients with few options for treatment. School budgets were slashed, and teachers often worked without pay for months at a time. Power outages became routine as the island's aging diesel generators broke down and couldn't be repaired. Even essential services like trash collection became unreliable, with garbage piling up in neighborhoods. The government, which had once provided free healthcare and education, now struggled just to keep the lights on. With the cash economy in ruins, many Nauruans returned to subsistence living. Families who had grown accustomed to imported goods and a steady flow of money now relied on fishing and small-scale gardening for survival. The transition was difficult. Traditional knowledge about farming and fishing had faded during the decades of prosperity, making it hard for people to adapt. Malnutrition and food insecurity emerged as serious problems for the first time in a generation. Years of dependence on processed imports meant that, paradoxically, obesity remained widespread even as hunger and undernourishment increased. This new reality left many families caught between two extremes: not enough healthy food, but plenty of unhealthy calories. Foreign aid became Nauru's lifeline. By 2005, more than 60% of the government's revenue came from Australian assistance, delivered through direct budget support and technical expertise. This dependency created new political tensions. In exchange for continued funding, Nauru had to accommodate Australian interests, including hosting controversial facilities and adopting certain policy reforms. The arrangement traded one form of reliance, on phosphate, for another, on foreign aid. Critics argued that this relationship locked Nauru into a cycle of dependency, offering little hope for genuine economic autonomy. The human cost of the collapse was visible everywhere. Younger Nauruans who had grown up during the boom years, expecting office jobs and financial security, faced a future with few opportunities. Many chose to emigrate to Australia or New Zealand in search of work, leading to a brain drain that further hampered recovery efforts. Those who stayed behind often struggled with addiction and mental health issues. Methamphetamine use surged, overwhelming the island's limited health services and fueling social problems. The psychological impact of falling from prosperity to poverty in a single generation left deep scars on the national psyche. Desperation led to increasingly risky and unconventional government decisions. By 2004, reports emerged of Nauru selling diplomatic recognition to countries like Taiwan and Kosovo in exchange for cash payments. The government also began selling passports to foreign nationals through opaque channels. At one point, officials even considered leasing part of the island to Australia for use as a military base, though public backlash forced them to abandon the idea. These measures, once unthinkable, revealed the extent of the crisis and how far Nauru had fallen from its former status. A controversial agreement with Australia soon became the government's last major source of income. Beginning in 2001, Nauru agreed to host a regional processing center for asylum seekers intercepted by Australian authorities. In return, the island received tens of millions of dollars annually, temporarily stabilizing government finances and providing some jobs. However, the arrangement came with significant costs. Human rights groups documented poor conditions in the detention center, including reports of abuse, suicide attempts, and medical neglect. The deal highlighted the difficult trade-offs Nauru faced as it tried to keep its economy afloat. Nauru's diminished international standing became apparent in the aftermath of the collapse. The country, which had once spent lavishly on diplomatic missions and international influence, now struggled to maintain even basic consular services. Foreign embassies closed, leaving only Australia and Taiwan with permanent representation by 2008. The nation's credit rating dropped to junk status, cutting off access to international borrowing. Even participation in global organizations like the United Nations was threatened by unpaid membership fees. Political instability followed the economic turmoil. Between 2003 and 2011, Nauru cycled through 10 different governments, driven by frequent no-confidence votes and leadership disputes. Corruption allegations plagued successive administrations, with several former presidents facing charges of financial mismanagement. The constant turnover made it nearly impossible to implement long-term recovery strategies. Civil society institutions weakened, and independent media outlets shuttered due to lack of funding. The absence of stable leadership left Nauru trapped in a cycle of crisis management rather than planning for the future. Environmental damage from decades of mining compounded the economic challenges. With most of the island's arable land destroyed, local agriculture was no longer viable. Over 90% of food now had to be imported, making Nauru highly vulnerable to global supply disruptions. Freshwater scarcity grew worse as mining runoff polluted the island's limited groundwater, forcing reliance on expensive desalination. These environmental constraints left the government with few options for meaningful economic development, reinforcing Nauru's dependence on aid and external support. Nauru's experience mirrors the pitfalls that resource-rich nations face when wealth is not managed wisely. The island's small size and concentrated economy made the collapse especially rapid and severe, but the underlying lessons are universal. Sovereign wealth funds require careful management and professional oversight, not political interference. Economic diversification cannot wait until a resource runs out. And no matter how abundant, natural wealth is never permanent. Recent efforts to diversify the economy have produced only modest results. Small fisheries projects and attempts to revive offshore banking have generated limited revenue. Secondary phosphate deposits discovered in 2015 allowed mining to resume at a fraction of its former scale, but this did little to offset the loss of the original resource. Today, Australia's financial support still accounts for more than half of Nauru's government income, and the Regional Processing Centre remains the island's largest employer. The reality is that Nauru continues to trade its sovereignty and dignity for economic survival, decades after the phosphate boom ended. The collapse did not just reshape Nauru's economy and politics, it altered daily life in profound ways. The abrupt end of prosperity forced changes in how people worked, what they ate, and how they viewed themselves. These shifts continue to affect the island's health and social fabric, setting the stage for new and unexpected challenges that emerged as the dust settled from the economic crash. The obesity epidemic no one saw coming. The rapid collapse of Nauru's phosphate economy didn't just erase jobs and income. It triggered one of the world's worst obesity and diabetes epidemics. In just a generation, the island's traditional way of eating and living was swept aside. As phosphate money poured in during the 1970s and 80s, fresh fish, coconut, and pandanus fruit disappeared from daily meals, replaced by imported processed foods. Canned meats, instant noodles, and sweetened drinks became staples almost overnight. With new wealth, families could afford products that had once been rare luxuries, but the health consequences were immediate and severe. This transformation was unusually abrupt. In other countries, dietary change happens slowly, giving people and institutions time to adapt. In Nauru, the shift was compressed into a single generation. The new cash economy meant most families stopped fishing and farming. Physical activity dropped as mining jobs replaced subsistence labor. The combination of sedentary lifestyles and calorie-dense foods created perfect conditions for rapid weight gain. By the time health officials recognized the scale of the problem, obesity had become the norm rather than the exception. By 2025, Nauru still holds the highest obesity rates in the world. More than 90% of adults are classified as overweight or obese. The World Health Organization has repeatedly cited Nauru's experience as a warning of how quickly public health can unravel after a sudden dietary transition. The normalization of these conditions happened so quickly that entire generations have grown up regarding processed, imported food as the default. The speed of change left little time for cultural adaptation or effective public health responses. The consequences extend far beyond weight. Nauru's rates of type 2 diabetes are the highest globally. By 2014, almost half of adults had developed the disease, a figure that remains stubbornly high. Chronic complications like kidney failure, vision loss, and amputations are now common. The burden on the healthcare system is immense. Before the phosphate era, diabetes was almost unknown on the island. Traditional diets and active lifestyles had protected Nauruans from the metabolic diseases that now dominate mortality statistics. Life expectancy offers a stark measure of the crisis. Today, the average Nauruan can expect to live around 60 years. This is significantly lower than other Pacific Island nations and reflects the impact of chronic diseases and poor nutrition. Many spend their later years managing multiple health conditions, often with limited access to care. The quality of life for older adults has declined sharply, with daily routines shaped by the need to manage diabetes, heart disease, and other obesity-related illnesses. The health system, never robust to begin with, struggles to cope. Nauru's main hospital lacks the specialists and technology needed to manage complex, chronic diseases. There is no local dialysis available, forcing patients to travel abroad for treatment at great personal and financial cost. Even basic medications like insulin are not always reliably available, with supply chain disruptions causing periodic shortages. Most resources go toward treating acute complications rather than prevention or long-term disease management. Funding shortfalls and understaffing mean public health campaigns are sporadic and often under-resourced. Cultural attitudes have also shifted with the changing food environment. In the past, Nauruan society associated larger body sizes with prosperity and well-being, a view shaped by years of hardship and scarcity. Today, those associations persist in subtle ways. For example, the ownership of large vehicles, despite the island's tiny road network, remains a visible status symbol, echoing the earlier link between abundance and success. These cultural markers make it difficult to challenge unhealthy behaviors, especially when combined with the normalization of processed foods across all age groups. Children are among the most affected. School health screenings regularly identify obese students with early-onset diabetes, conditions that were virtually unheard of before the phosphate boom. The mining-damaged landscape offers few places for safe outdoor play or sports. School lunch programs, intended to provide balanced meals, often fall short due to budget and supply constraints. As a result, many children face the prospect of shortened lifespans and lifelong health complications before reaching adulthood. Economic realities reinforce these patterns. With most of the island's arable land destroyed by mining, local agriculture is nearly impossible. Imported processed foods, which are shelf-stable and cheap, dominate store shelves. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and fish are scarce and expensive, making it hard for families to afford healthier options. Most households prioritize quantity over quality, especially when feeding large families on limited incomes. Government nutrition assistance programs exist, but they struggle to make a meaningful impact given the scale of the challenge and the high cost of fresh food. Public health interventions have had limited success. In 2014, the government introduced a sugar tax on soft drinks and other sweetened products. The measure produced a brief decline in consumption, but most people quickly adapted by switching to other sources of sugar or simply absorbing the extra cost. Community-based exercise programs and school nutrition education have been launched, but ingrained habits and limited resources have kept participation low. The most successful interventions, such as Australia-funded dialysis services, address symptoms rather than underlying causes. Without systemic changes to the food environment and economic incentives, individual behavior change remains out of reach for most. The economic costs are substantial. Diabetes and obesity-related conditions consume nearly 20% of Nauru's healthcare budget, a striking figure for a country with so few resources. Lost productivity from chronic illness further strains an economy already weakened by high unemployment. Even the government's main source of employment, the Regional Processing Center, struggles to find enough healthy workers. Some analysts estimate that obesity-related losses could exceed 5% of GDP, creating a vicious cycle where poor health impedes economic recovery, which in turn makes health improvements even harder. Nauru's situation stands out even among its Pacific neighbors. While obesity rates have risen across the region, no other island nation matches Nauru's extreme numbers. Countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu adopted processed foods later and retained more of their traditional food systems. Samoa and Tonga responded to their own health crises with more aggressive public health campaigns. Nauru's unique combination of sudden wealth, rapid dietary change, and environmental devastation left it with few alternatives when the phosphate money ran out. Recent years have brought some small, positive steps. A handful of aquaculture projects supply local markets with fresh fish. Some families are reviving traditional cooking methods, adapting them to use whatever ingredients are available. Youth sports programs, often organized by churches or community groups, have gained popularity. However, these efforts remain isolated and have not produced large-scale change. The core challenge persists: rebuilding a healthy food system in an environment where economic and logistical barriers push people toward unhealthy choices. The role of global food corporations cannot be ignored. During the boom years, transnational companies aggressively marketed their products on Nauru, associating Western brands and processed foods with modernity and status. These marketing campaigns were highly successful, and the resulting dietary preferences have proven difficult to reverse. Some public health advocates now argue that these companies should bear some responsibility for helping to address the crisis they helped create, but so far, little has changed. Environmental pressures, especially climate change, add new layers of difficulty. Rising sea temperatures threaten already depleted fish stocks. More frequent storms disrupt food imports, leading to shortages and price spikes. Hotter weather makes outdoor exercise more challenging. These factors further limit options for improving public health and highlight the island's vulnerability to external shocks. The obesity crisis also reflects deeper divisions within Nauruan society. Poorer households are at greatest risk, as they have the least access to healthy food and the fewest resources to manage chronic illness. Tensions sometimes arise between advocates of traditional healing and proponents of Western medicine, complicating efforts to build consensus around solutions. Generational divides are also evident, with younger Nauruans more likely to accept current dietary habits as normal, while some elders recall healthier times and push for change. For other countries, Nauru's experience offers clear warnings. It shows how quickly health can deteriorate when dietary transitions outpace public health infrastructure and cultural adaptation. The dangers of prioritizing short-term economic gain over sustainable food systems are evident. Once entrenched, unhealthy patterns are extremely difficult to reverse, and the costs, both human and financial, continue to grow long after the initial changes. Nauru's story is rarely told in tourist brochures. Promotional materials highlight the island's clear waters and palm-lined shores, but omit the mined-out interior and the hospital wards crowded with diabetes patients. The reality is more complicated and less marketable, a nation still living with the consequences of choices made decades earlier. Looking ahead, the path to recovery is uncertain. Some experts believe that generational change and ongoing public health efforts will slowly improve outcomes. Others warn that the damage may be irreversible, with metabolic disorders potentially passed down for generations. What is clear is that the decisions made during the phosphate boom continue to shape daily life, linking economic history to health in ways that are difficult to untangle. In many respects, the obesity epidemic encapsulates the broader story of Nauru. The same lack of planning and foresight that led to economic collapse also allowed a public health crisis to take root. Both were driven by a focus on short-term rewards at the expense of long-term resilience. Today, Nauru faces the dual burden of economic hardship and widespread chronic illness, each reinforcing the other in a cycle that is hard to break. As the government searches for ways to stabilize the economy, the health crisis remains a constant reminder of how quickly fortunes can change and how difficult it is to recover once the damage is done. The search for new sources of income has led Nauru down increasingly unconventional paths, each shaped by the urgent need to survive in the aftermath of the phosphate era. Desperate times, desperate measures. By the late 1990s, Nauru's government faced a stark reality. With phosphate mining finished and the economy in freefall, there were few legitimate options left to keep the country afloat. In this climate of desperation, leaders turned to increasingly unconventional and controversial ways to generate revenue. The first of these was a bold attempt to reinvent the island as an offshore banking hub. Nauru's offshore banking sector emerged almost overnight. By the early 1990s, the government had issued licenses to around 400 foreign banks, a staggering figure for a country with fewer than 11,000 residents. These banks were not required to maintain a physical presence on the island, and the licensing process involved little more than paperwork and payment of substantial fees. The appeal for foreign clients was clear. Nauru offered near-total anonymity, minimal oversight, and a regulatory environment that welcomed financial flows from anywhere in the world. For a brief period, licensing fees from these shell banks injected much-needed cash into government coffers. But the scheme quickly drew international scrutiny. Reports surfaced linking Nauru's banks to money laundering operations, organized crime syndicates, and questionable transfers involving billions of dollars. The Financial Action Task Force, FATF, placed Nauru on its blacklist, and mounting pressure from the United States and other countries intensified. In 2005, the U.S. Treasury classified Nauru as a rogue state under the Patriot Act, effectively cutting it off from the global financial system. The IMF echoed this designation, demanding urgent reforms. Faced with sanctions and the threat of total economic isolation, Nauru's government shut down the offshore banking sector that same year, requiring a physical presence for all bank licenses. The entire episode lasted less than a decade, generated only a modest windfall, and left the island's reputation badly damaged. With the collapse of the banking experiment, Nauru's search for alternative income sources became more urgent. In 2001, a new opportunity appeared, one that would reshape the country's economy for years to come. Australia, eager to deter asylum seekers arriving by boat, proposed a deal. In exchange for substantial annual payments, Nauru would host a regional processing center for refugees intercepted at sea. The Nauruan government agreed, and the first facility opened at topside later that year. The arrangement, known as the Pacific Solution, quickly became the cornerstone of Nauru's post-phosphate economy. Australia paid tens of millions of dollars annually for the right to process and detain asylum seekers on Nauruan soil. The government collected revenue not just from direct payments, but also from fees for visas, land leases, and utility services tied to the center's operation. Local businesses sprang up to provide catering, laundry, maintenance, and transport for the facility and its staff. The economic impact was immediate and transformative. By 2019-20, the Nauru Regional Processing Center, RPC, accounted for 58% of total government revenue and directly employed 15% of the island's workforce. The government itself employed over half the working population, with many jobs tied either directly or indirectly to the detention industry. Salaries from these positions circulated through the economy, supporting shops, restaurants, and service providers that might otherwise have disappeared. For many families, employment at the RPC replaced the phosphate jobs lost years earlier. The scale of the detention operation dwarfed every other economic activity on the island. Fisheries and small-scale agriculture generated minimal income by comparison. Secondary phosphate mining, resumed on a limited basis, contributed less than 10% of government revenue. Other ventures, such as attempts to revive offshore financial services under stricter regulations, remained marginal. The RPC became not just the largest employer, but the economic backbone of the country. This new dependency shaped nearly every aspect of Nauru's development. Government budgets prioritized investments in detention-related infrastructure. Roads, housing, and utilities were upgraded to support the facility and its contractors. Local training programs focused on skills needed by the RPC, security, catering, administration, rather than diversifying the economy. The island's limited resources, both financial and human, were channeled into sustaining and expanding the detention industry, echoing the patterns of the phosphate era. The social impact was significant. As jobs clustered around the detention center, workers migrated from outlying districts to the main settlement, putting pressure on housing and local services. Rental prices surged, and inflation pushed up the cost of basic goods, making life harder for those not employed by the RPC. The influx of foreign contractors and security staff, mostly from Australia and New Zealand, introduced new cultural dynamics and sometimes fueled tension with local residents. For many young Nauruans, the detention center became the only realistic career path, narrowing aspirations and reinforcing economic dependence on a single, externally controlled industry. Diplomatic realities further complicated the situation. Australia's aid to Nauru became closely tied to the continued operation of the RPC. When payment disputes or political disagreements arose, Australia leveraged its financial support to push for policy concessions or operational changes. In 2015, for example, a standoff over contract terms led to a temporary freeze in infrastructure grants until Nauru agreed to new conditions. This power imbalance left Nauru with little real bargaining power, despite the formal sovereignty it maintained over its territory. The arrangement also created a path dependency that made it difficult to consider alternatives. As the RPC expanded, other sectors were sidelined. Investment in fisheries, tourism, or renewable energy was minimal compared to spending on detention-related projects. The government's focus on immediate cash flow meant that little was set aside for long-term development or rebuilding the depleted sovereign wealth fund. Despite years of substantial RPC revenue, the fund remained nearly empty and government reserves were thin. The sustainability of this economic model is uncertain. The RPC's future depends entirely on Australian immigration policy, which can change with little warning. If Australia were to close or downsize the center, Nauru would lose its primary source of income almost overnight, an echo of the abrupt end of phosphate mining decades earlier. Automation and shifting political priorities in Australia could further reduce the center's size or staffing needs. Despite these risks, Nauru has few contingency plans in place. The lack of economic diversification leaves the country exposed to another sudden collapse. Other Pacific nations have made similar trade-offs, though not always with the same human cost. Tuvalu profits from leasing its .tv internet domain, while Kiribati relies on fishing licenses that have drawn criticism for unsustainable practices. What sets Nauru apart is the direct human impact of its chosen industry. The RPC's operation has drawn consistent criticism from human rights organizations, which have documented overcrowding, inadequate medical care, and psychological harm among detainees. While these issues are important, the focus here is on the economic calculus that led Nauru to embrace such a controversial role. Within Nauru, the ethical dilemmas are felt acutely. Many citizens recognize the detention center's flaws, but rely on the jobs it provides to support their families. Former phosphate workers now serve as guards, cooks, or maintenance staff at the facility. Their wages pay for school fees and medical care in a country where alternatives are scarce. Community leaders express unease about the arrangement, but admit that without the RPC, Nauru would face immediate and severe hardship. Legal and political challenges continue to mount. Australian courts have ordered compensation for mistreated detainees, and international tribunals have questioned the RPC's compliance with refugee conventions. Each new case increases operational costs and raises doubts about the center's long-term viability. Yet for now, the RPC remains the linchpin of Nauru's economy. The psychological effects of this dependency are subtle but real. Economic uncertainty and moral conflict have contributed to rising substance abuse and declining participation in traditional cultural activities. Young people, seeing few options beyond the detention center, are less engaged in civic life and more likely to consider emigration. The social fabric, already strained by decades of economic upheaval, faces new pressures as the island adapts to its latest reality. Financial audits show that despite the RPC's windfall, little has been invested in rebuilding the nation's reserves or preparing for the future. Government spending patterns echo those of the phosphate boom, with current expenditures prioritized over long-term planning. The Sovereign Wealth Fund remains depleted, and public infrastructure projects are mostly tied to the needs of the detention industry. As of 2025, the RPC's role in Nauru's economy has only deepened. Australia has expanded the center's mandate to include processing visa applicants from other Pacific countries, and new contracts call for longer-term housing of detainees. These developments suggest that, barring a major policy shift, the detention industry will remain central to Nauru's economic life for the foreseeable future. The choices Nauru has made are best understood in the context of necessity rather than preference. Economic desperation has driven the government to embrace models that prioritize immediate survival over sustainable development. The pattern is familiar: short-term solutions that provide temporary stability but leave the island vulnerable to future shocks. Nauru's experience raises uncomfortable questions about sovereignty, ethics, and the limits of economic adaptation. With few resources and limited bargaining power, the country has repeatedly found itself trading long-term well-being for short-term relief. The consequences of these decisions continue to shape daily life, setting the stage for the precarious situation the island faces today. 2025 Update: Nauru's Precarious Present. Nauru's current reality in 2025 reflects the cumulative weight of decades of economic missteps, environmental damage, and external dependence. The island's GDP is projected to reach $160 million this year, a marginal 0.2% increase since 2022. While this figure shows a slight uptick, it remains a fraction of what Nauru once commanded during the peak of its phosphate era. The country's population now stands at nearly 12,900, a modest increase from recent years, but still well below its historical high. This stabilization, however, masks deeper demographic shifts. Many of Nauru's young adults continue to leave for Australia or New Zealand, seeking opportunities that simply do not exist at home. The ongoing emigration drains the island of skilled workers and further weakens its prospects for recovery. The employment landscape remains stark. Official unemployment data is unreliable, but it is clear that underemployment is widespread and most work is directly tied to the government or the Regional Processing Center, RPC, for asylum seekers. Around 95% of those with formal jobs work for the government, while private sector activity is largely confined to small retail shops and basic services. The island's economic structure is as lopsided as it was during the phosphate boom. Only now the main pillar is not a natural resource, but an externally funded detention facility. Young people who complete their education face limited local prospects, and many opt to leave, accelerating the brain drain. This persistent outflow of talent makes it even harder for Nauru to develop new industries or diversify its economy. Australian support remains the foundation of Nauru's public finances. In 2025, Australia has pledged 140 million Australian dollars in financial support over 5 years, with 100 million Australian dollars earmarked for direct budget assistance. Together with RPC-related payments, these sources account for over 60% of government revenue. This dependence gives Australia significant leverage over Nauru's policy choices, as seen in recent years when disputes over detention center contracts led to the suspension of infrastructure grants until Nauru agreed to new terms. The arrangement leaves Nauru with limited autonomy over its own affairs, and the government's ability to set independent priorities is sharply constrained. Fiscal reserves remain thin. As of the 2024 fiscal year, Nauru's gross reserves stand at 85 million Australian dollars, enough to cover only about 3.4 months of imports. The Nauru Intergenerational Trust Fund, intended to secure the future with savings from phosphate revenues, contains barely enough to support 6 months of government spending. Mismanagement, political interference, and poor investment decisions have all contributed to the fund's decline. International bodies note that persistent reliance on external aid is a direct consequence of the failure to establish new industries or manage past windfalls wisely. The island's environmental condition continues to limit options for growth. About 80% of Nauru's interior remains uninhabitable due to the legacy of phosphate mining. Rehabilitation efforts, despite decades of discussion and sporadic investment, have achieved little. Most of the population is crowded along the narrow coastal strip, where the risk from rising sea levels and storm surges grows every year. The government has launched the Higher Ground Initiative, an ambitious plan to relocate residents to elevated areas using imported fill, but progress is slow and funding remains inadequate. The environmental scars left by mining are a daily reality, shaping everything from housing to food security. Climate change is now an existential threat. Rising sea levels and more frequent extreme weather events threaten to further erode habitable land and contaminate freshwater supplies. Saltwater intrusion affects the island's fragile groundwater lens, forcing greater reliance on desalination plants that are expensive to operate and maintain. Cyclones and king tides damage already vulnerable infrastructure, roads, housing, and utilities that is often in disrepair after years of underinvestment. The government is active in international climate forums, advocating for stronger global action, but its influence remains limited by its small size and economic dependence. Attempts to diversify the economy have yielded little progress. Limited phosphate mining continues on lower-grade reserves, now contributing less than 10% of national income and employing far fewer workers than in the past. The Economic and Climate Resilience Citizenship Program, which offers citizenship in exchange for investment, has attracted only modest interest and generated limited funds for infrastructure and climate adaptation. Tourism remains a distant goal. The environmental devastation and minimal visitor facilities deter all but the most intrepid travelers, and the industry's contribution to the economy is negligible. Efforts to expand fisheries have produced little, as most catches are handled by foreign vessels under licensing agreements, with little value added locally. The RPC, meanwhile, has become the economic linchpin. It employs about 15% of the workforce and, together with Australian aid, accounts for more than 60% of government revenue. The centre's presence shapes everything from the labour market to government budgeting. Recent expansions in contract terms reflect Australia's shifting immigration policies, with longer-term detainee housing now part of the arrangement. The RPC's dominance has fostered a dependency that closely mirrors the phosphate era. Once again, Nauru's fortunes hinge on decisions made in Canberra rather than on the island itself. Social indicators remain troubling. Over 90% of adults are overweight or obese, and the prevalence of type 2 diabetes is among the world's highest. Life expectancy is around 60 years, significantly lower than other Pacific Island nations. Mental health problems are on the rise, particularly among young people who see limited options for their future. Substance abuse and related social issues persist, a legacy of rapid economic decline and ongoing uncertainty. The health system, reliant on Australian funding, struggles to meet the growing demand for chronic disease care and basic services. Infrastructure challenges compound these difficulties. The national power grid depends on aging diesel generators, which are prone to breakdowns and fuel shortages. Water supply is unreliable, with desalination plants often stretched to capacity and vulnerable to technical failures. Roads are in poor condition, and many villages are isolated during periods of heavy rain. Air links are minimal, with just 2 weekly commercial flights connecting Nauru to the outside world. These logistical barriers make it difficult to attract investment or develop new industries, reinforcing the cycle of dependence. Education outcomes reflect the broader malaise. The secondary school system faces chronic teacher shortages and outdated curricula. While the phosphate era once funded scholarships for overseas study, most students today have limited opportunities. Many families prioritize immediate employment at the RPC over further education, a pattern that echoes the short-term thinking that contributed to Nauru's earlier collapse. The lack of investment in human capital hampers any effort to build a more diverse or resilient economy. Cultural changes are also underway. Traditional practices such as canoe building and pandanus weaving are fading as older generations pass away. English increasingly dominates in business and government, and fluency in the Nauruan language is declining. Younger residents are more likely to identify with globalized, Western cultural norms, a shift accelerated by media exposure and interactions with foreign workers at the RPC. These trends worry cultural preservationists, who see heritage and identity at risk alongside economic sovereignty. Nauru's international standing is diminished. Where the island once played a role as a donor in Pacific development, it now relies on regional aid programs and must navigate relationships with larger neighbors. Its vote in the United Nations sometimes draws attention from states seeking support on specific issues, but this influence is fleeting. Climate advocacy remains one of the few areas where Nauru's voice is consistently heard, though its ability to shape outcomes is limited by resource constraints. The risks facing Nauru in 2025 are clear. Volatile aid flows, the potential closure or downsizing of the RPC, and the absence of real private sector growth all threaten the island's fragile stability. Phosphate reserves will eventually be exhausted, and climate change is accelerating the loss of habitable land. Political instability continues to undermine long-term planning. Recent years have seen frequent leadership changes and ongoing corruption investigations, deterring foreign investment and complicating efforts to implement needed reforms. Anti-corruption measures are in place, but enforcement is weak and patronage networks remain entrenched. Some modest sources of hope exist. Remittances from Nauruans living abroad provide a lifeline for many families and support local businesses. International partnerships on renewable energy projects may, over time, reduce dependence on imported diesel and lower the cost of electricity. Upgrades to digital infrastructure are slowly connecting more Nauruans to global opportunities, offering the prospect of remote work and new forms of economic participation. These developments, though small in scale, point to possible pathways for the future. Yet none of these efforts approach the scale needed to fundamentally transform Nauru's economy or break the pattern of dependence. The fundamental dilemma persists: how to build a sustainable future without repeating the mistakes of the past. For now, the country remains caught between the need for immediate survival and the challenge of long-term resilience. The question is whether Nauru can learn from its own history, or whether it will continue to follow a path already traveled by other resource-rich nations that failed to adapt when the boom ended. Lessons not learned. The lessons from Nauru's experience are not confined to a remote Pacific island. They echo in resource-rich nations around the globe. The island's rise and fall illustrate the dangers of the so-called resource curse, where the discovery of natural wealth leads to a cycle of boom and bust rather than lasting prosperity. Nauru's story is a concentrated version of a pattern that has played out in countries both large and small, where the promise of easy riches undermines the discipline needed for sustainable development. At its core, the resource curse is a problem of over-reliance. Nauru became singularly dependent on phosphate mining, funneling nearly all economic activity and government revenue into a single industry. For decades, this strategy seemed to work. The money flowed, public services expanded, and living standards soared. But as with many other resource-dependent economies, the underlying vulnerabilities were masked by the temporary abundance. The government had little incentive to nurture other sectors, and the population grew accustomed to a standard of living that was entirely contingent on a finite resource. This lack of diversification is not unique to Nauru. Venezuela, for example, experienced a similar trajectory with oil. Immense wealth from petroleum exports created the illusion of stability, but when prices dropped and reserves dwindled, the economy unraveled. Like Nauru, Venezuela failed to invest in alternative industries or to create buffers against inevitable downturns. Both nations watched prosperity evaporate as quickly as it had appeared, exposing the fragility of their economic foundations. By contrast, some countries have managed to avoid the worst effects of the resource curse. Several Gulf states, including Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, recognized early on that oil wealth would not last forever. They used windfall revenues to build sovereign wealth funds, invest in infrastructure, and develop sectors like tourism, aviation, and financial services. These efforts did not eliminate risk, but they provided a measure of resilience. When oil prices fluctuated, diversified economies were better equipped to weather the storm. Norway offers perhaps the clearest example of prudent resource management. The country established its sovereign wealth fund in 1990, investing oil revenues in a broad portfolio of global assets. Strict rules govern withdrawals, and the fund operates with a high degree of transparency and accountability. Norway's approach is grounded in the recognition that natural resource wealth is temporary and must be managed for the benefit of both current and future generations. This mindset stands in stark contrast to Nauru's experience, where windfall profits were treated as a permanent entitlement and spent as quickly as they arrived. Nauru's failure to diversify was compounded by its small size and geographic isolation. With a limited population and little arable land, the country faced real obstacles to developing new industries. Yet these constraints made it even more important to plan for the future. Small economies are particularly vulnerable to external shocks, and their margin for error is slim. When the phosphate industry collapsed, there was no safety net, no manufacturing base, no tourism sector, no significant fisheries, and no reserves to cushion the blow. The cycle of boom and bust was further intensified by a lack of institutional capacity. Nauru's government, flush with phosphate royalties, expanded rapidly, but did not invest in building the expertise or systems needed to manage complex finances. The Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust, intended as a safeguard for the future, was mismanaged and depleted by risky investments and poor oversight. There was little transparency or accountability, and political leaders often prioritized personal or short-term gains over national interests. This pattern of mismanagement is common in resource-rich states, where concentrated revenue streams can weaken the checks and balances that underpin good governance. Environmental neglect is another recurring theme. During the phosphate boom, the focus was almost entirely on extraction and immediate profit. Rehabilitation of mined land was neglected, and environmental impact assessments were minimal or absent. The result was the near-total devastation of Nauru's interior, with lasting consequences for food security, water supply, and public health. This disregard for environmental costs is not unique to Nauru. Oil spills in Nigeria, deforestation in the Amazon, and pollution in mining regions worldwide show how short-term economic priorities often override long-term. Ecological stability. Corruption and patronage networks flourish in the shadow of resource wealth. In Nauru, lucrative contracts and government positions were often awarded based on political loyalty rather than merit. The influx of money created opportunities for graft and fostered a culture of impunity. Similar dynamics have played out in countries like Angola and Equatorial Guinea, where oil and mineral wealth has entrenched ruling elites and stifled broader development. Concentrated, unaccountable revenue streams make it easier for corruption to take root and harder for citizens to demand accountability. The warning signs of impending collapse were visible long before Nauru's economy hit bottom. Geologists and financial advisors repeatedly cautioned about the finite nature of phosphate reserves and the dangers of risky investments. Yet the political system rewarded those who promised immediate benefits, and difficult decisions were deferred until crisis became unavoidable. This tendency to ignore or downplay early warnings is a hallmark of the resource curse, seen in countries from Venezuela to Nigeria. Dutch disease compounded Nauru's problems. The influx of phosphate revenue caused the local currency, the Australian dollar in Nauru's case, to appreciate, making other exports less competitive. Local agriculture suffered not only from environmental destruction, but also from the economic distortions created by easy money. Similar effects have crippled manufacturing and farming sectors in oil-rich countries, where resource booms drive up costs and crowd out alternative industries. Resource wealth can also distort the relationship between government and citizens. When most state revenue comes from a single source, leaders become less accountable to taxpayers. In Nauru, the government relied on phosphate royalties rather than broad-based taxation, weakening the social contract that normally ties public spending to public input. This dynamic is common in resource-dependent states and often leads to weaker institutions and less responsive governance. The collapse of Nauru's offshore banking experiment in the 1990s provided a brief, unsustainable reprieve. The government issued licenses to hundreds of shell banks, attracting scrutiny and eventually sanctions from the international community. The sector was shut down by 2005, leaving little lasting benefit and further damaging the country's reputation. This episode was followed by reliance on hosting Australia's Regional Processing Centre for asylum seekers. By 2025, the centre and related Australian aid account for over 60% of government revenue and employ about 15% of the workforce. This dependency mirrors the phosphate era in its concentration and vulnerability, and it leaves Nauru exposed to policy changes beyond its control. Attempts to build new sources of income have produced limited results. Tourism initiatives have failed to generate meaningful revenue, hindered by environmental degradation and the lack of infrastructure. Small-scale fisheries and secondary phosphate mining contribute only marginally to the economy. The persistent reliance on external funding and a single dominant industry reflects a broader failure to learn from past mistakes. Demographic and psychological factors also played a role. The sudden influx of wealth in a tiny population produced dramatic per capita gains, but these were not matched by gradual improvements in productive capacity or financial literacy. Many Nauruans shifted from subsistence living to high consumption almost overnight, with little opportunity to develop the skills or habits needed for long-term economic sustainability. When the boom ended, the adjustment was severe and widespread. Cultural traditions shaped the way wealth was distributed and spent. Nauru's communal values encouraged sharing and immediate consumption, which initially helped to spread the benefits of phosphate money. However, these same values conflicted with the need to save and invest for the future. Societies with strong norms around long-term planning and disciplined saving, such as Norway or Alaska, have been better able to convert resource windfalls into lasting prosperity. Power imbalances with foreign corporations and governments further disadvantaged Nauru. During the colonial period and after independence, the island had little leverage in negotiations with mining companies or aid donors. Decisions about extraction rates, environmental protection, and revenue sharing were often made elsewhere, with limited input from Nauruans themselves. This lack of bargaining power is a common challenge for small states, especially when dealing with multinational firms or larger neighboring countries. Transition planning was notably absent. While some countries have begun preparing for life after resource depletion decades in advance, Nauru waited until the phosphate was nearly gone before considering alternatives. This failure to anticipate and plan for inevitable change is a defining feature of the resource curse. Once the crisis arrived, options were limited and the costs of inaction became painfully clear. Modern economies continue to repeat the mistakes seen in Nauru, though the resources and contexts may differ. Overconcentration in a single industry, whether oil, technology, or finance, creates vulnerabilities that can lead to sudden downturns. The lessons from Nauru are not just about phosphate or small islands. They are about the universal risks of short-term thinking, inadequate planning, and ignoring the signals that precede collapse. The most striking aspect of Nauru's story is not the scale of its rise and fall, but the predictability of the outcome. The warning signs were clear, the mechanisms well understood, and the consequences entirely avoidable. Yet similar patterns appear in resource-dependent states around the world. The details may differ, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. Windfalls are squandered, diversification is neglected, and environmental and social costs accumulate until the system can no longer sustain itself. In the end, Nauru's experience stands as a detailed illustration of how easily temporary prosperity can become a long-term liability. The country's struggles with economic dependence, mismanagement, environmental degradation, and social upheaval are not isolated events. They are part of a broader pattern that continues to surface wherever resource wealth is treated as a shortcut rather than an opportunity for careful stewardship. The same warning signs that went unheeded in Nauru can be seen in other economies today, each at risk of repeating the cycle unless lessons are finally learned. Could Nauru happen again? The risk that another Nauru could emerge is not hypothetical. Across the world, economies both large and small display the same vulnerabilities that once defined Nauru's rise and fall. The question is not if a similar collapse could happen again, but where and under what circumstances. Nauru's fate is a stark reminder of what can occur when short-term gains overshadow long-term planning, and when the allure of easy money blinds decision-makers to the dangers of over-reliance and neglect. Consider the petrostates, nations whose prosperity depends on the extraction and export of oil and gas. These countries often experience rapid economic growth during boom periods, only to confront severe downturns when prices collapse or reserves run low. Venezuela offers a clear parallel. Once among the wealthiest countries in Latin America, it built its economy almost entirely on oil revenues. When oil prices plummeted in 2014, Venezuela's GDP shrank by more than a third within 5 years. Hyperinflation, widespread shortages, and social unrest followed. The government's failure to diversify, invest in other industries, or build up financial reserves left the country exposed to the same kind of shock that devastated Nauru when phosphate mining ended. Despite the scale difference, the underlying dynamics remain familiar. A single resource sustains the entire system, and when that resource falters, everything else follows. Modern economies built on new forms of concentrated wealth face similar risks. Cryptocurrency hubs, for example, have grown rapidly on the back of digital asset booms. Towns in China and Russia that became dependent on crypto mining saw their fortunes evaporate almost overnight when governments imposed bans or electricity prices surged. The 2022 crypto market crash wiped out vast amounts of paper wealth, leaving communities that had tied their futures to digital currencies scrambling for alternatives. These episodes echo Nauru's experience, where prosperity seemed secure until external forces, regulatory shifts, market downturns, or technological changes revealed just how fragile the foundation really was. Technology-driven cities and regions are not immune either. Silicon Valley, with its concentration of venture capital and tech talent, has weathered multiple cycles of growth and contraction. Yet its continued dominance depends on the sustained success of a handful of industries. If global demand for certain technologies wanes, or if innovation migrates elsewhere, the region could face a sharp correction. Other tech boomtowns, from Austin to Shenzhen, have staked their growth on similar bets. The lesson from Nauru is clear. Even the most dynamic economies can become vulnerable if they rely too heavily on a single engine of growth and fail to prepare for inevitable shifts. Personal finance offers a microcosm of these risks. Individuals who depend on a single employer or skill set are exposed to sudden reversals, job loss, industry decline, or technological obsolescence. The 2008 financial crisis highlighted how overconcentration in real estate and a lack of diversification could devastate households and entire economies. Professional gamers and gig economy workers, whose incomes hinge on a single platform or market trend, face the same precariousness. Nauru's collapse is a magnified version of what happens when people or institutions fail to hedge against the unexpected. Diversification stands as the most effective defense against these dangers. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, now valued at over $1 trillion, is built on the principle of spreading risk across global markets and asset classes. The fund invests oil revenues in thousands of companies and properties worldwide, ensuring that no single downturn can threaten the country's long-term stability. Other nations, like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, have used their resource wealth to build up tourism, finance, and logistics sectors. These efforts do not eliminate risk, but they reduce dependence on one volatile source of income and create buffers against future shocks. The contrast with Nauru could not be starker. Instead of using phosphate profits to build a diversified economy, Nauru spent freely and failed to plan for the day when mining would end. The result was a catastrophic collapse that left the country dependent on foreign aid and a single controversial industry, the Regional Processing Center for Asylum Seekers. In 2025, this facility and related Australian support account for 58% of government revenue, a new form of dependence that exposes Nauru to policy changes beyond its control. The lesson is not just about resources, but about the need for strategic foresight and the discipline to invest in resilience. Sustainable growth also requires looking beyond immediate profits to consider long-term consequences. Germany's transition away from fossil fuels through its Energy Wende policy is a case in point. By investing in renewables and planning for the eventual decline of coal and nuclear power, Germany has sought to avoid the sudden shocks that have destabilized other economies. In contrast, regions like West Virginia, which clung to coal until market forces made change unavoidable, continue to struggle with unemployment and economic stagnation. The timing of transition matters, a lesson Nauru's leaders ignored when they delayed diversification until it was too late. Environmental factors are inseparable from economic sustainability. Nauru's phosphate mining devastated the island's interior, leaving 80% of its land uninhabitable and creating lasting health and social challenges. Similar patterns are visible in other resource-driven economies. The lithium mining boom in Chile's Atacama Desert, for example, is depleting scarce water supplies in one of the world's driest regions. Deep-sea mining projects threaten fragile marine ecosystems in pursuit of minerals for new technologies. These cases show that environmental costs, if ignored, can undermine the very prosperity that resource extraction is meant to create. Nauru's experience underscores the need to factor sustainability into every economic decision. The quality of governance ultimately determines whether resource wealth becomes a blessing or a curse. Botswana, for example, used diamond revenues to invest in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, transforming itself from one of Africa's poorest countries into an upper-middle-income nation. Transparent institutions, anti-corruption measures, and democratic accountability were key to this success. In contrast, Nauru's history is marked by mismanagement, political instability, and a lack of oversight. The country cycled through frequent government changes, and reforms were often derailed by competing interests. This pattern is not unique. Resource-rich states with weak institutions frequently fall into similar traps. The pressure to adapt is especially acute for countries facing the energy transition. As the world moves away from fossil fuels to combat climate change, oil-dependent nations must diversify or risk repeating Nauru's fate. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 strategy, which aims to build new industries around tourism and technology, is an attempt to prepare for a post-oil future. Others, however, continue to double down on petroleum, hoping that demand will remain strong. The experience of Nauru suggests that waiting until the resource runs out or global demand collapses leaves little room for a smooth transition. Small developing nations with new resource discoveries face their own crossroads. Guyana's recent offshore oil finds could fuel rapid development or lead to dysfunction, depending on how revenues are managed. Timor-Leste's Petroleum Fund provides a model for responsible stewardship, with strict withdrawal limits and a focus on long-term stability. The challenge is to resist the temptation of immediate spending and to invest in diversified, sustainable growth. Political realities often make this difficult, as short-term gains are more attractive to leaders and voters alike. Even within advanced economies, sectoral overconcentration can create Nauru-like vulnerabilities. Detroit's dependence on automotive manufacturing left it exposed to global competition and technological change, culminating in bankruptcy and population decline. Pittsburgh, by contrast, reinvented itself as a center for technology and healthcare, demonstrating that proactive adaptation is possible. The difference lies in whether decision-makers recognize the need for change before crisis strikes. The personal finance analogy is instructive. Workers in the gig economy, for example, must navigate the risks of relying on a single platform or type of work. Those who diversify their income streams, develop a range of skills, and build up savings are better positioned to weather disruptions. This mirrors the approach that could have saved Nauru, using temporary windfalls to create a foundation for future security, rather than assuming the good times would last. The cryptocurrency sector offers another modern parallel. Mining hubs in places like Irkutsk, Russia, thrived on cheap electricity and favorable regulations, but collapsed when conditions changed. The volatility of digital assets makes fortunes rise and fall even faster than in traditional resource economies. Prudent investors diversify across different protocols and asset classes, hedging against the risk that any one market could evaporate. The lesson is the same. Concentration breeds fragility, while diversification fosters resilience. climate change compounds these risks. For nations built on resource extraction, especially those in vulnerable environments, rising sea levels, extreme weather, and environmental degradation can accelerate economic decline. Nauru's mined-out landscape now faces the additional threat of coastal erosion and saltwater intrusion, further reducing habitable land. Countries that fail to plan for these challenges risk compounding the effects of economic mismanagement with irreversible environmental loss. Digital economies are not immune. Social media platforms and tech giants that built fortunes on engagement algorithms have seen revenues vanish when user behavior shifts or regulators intervene. The suddenness of these reversals mirrors the abrupt end of Nauru's phosphate era. Companies that invest in new products and markets are better able to adapt, while those that cling to a single business model become vulnerable to disruption. Even stable, diversified economies are not exempt from the lessons of Nauru. Japan's demographic challenges and China's property market instability show how over-reliance on a single variable or sector can threaten broader economic health. The key is to recognize vulnerability before it becomes crisis, and to act decisively to build resilience. In the end, the question of whether another Nauru could happen again is less about geography or resources and more about choices. The patterns are clear, the risks are well understood, and the tools for prevention are available. What matters is whether leaders, institutions, and individuals are willing to look beyond immediate rewards and invest in a future that can withstand change. Nauru's legacy is not just a warning, but a call to action for anyone responsible for managing wealth, resources, or opportunity. The consequences of ignoring these lessons are written not just in the history of a small Pacific island, but in the persistent vulnerabilities that shape economies everywhere. As the world faces new waves of technological, environmental, and social change, the importance of foresight and prudent management grows ever more urgent. Nauru's story stands as a reminder that temporary wealth, no matter how great, cannot substitute for lasting vision. Nauru's journey from a world-leading GDP per capita of $88,000 in 1981 to a 2024 economy worth just $160 million is a stark example of how quickly fortunes can reverse. The absence of a functioning sovereign wealth fund meant there was no buffer when phosphate revenues vanished, leaving the island exposed to economic shocks and dependent on external aid. The scars of this collapse, environmental, financial, and social, remain visible today. Nauru's experience serves as a direct warning. The true cost of failing to plan for the end of abundance can be devastating. When wealth runs out, will our leaders remember Nauru's story?